I haven't been in the bike industry for 15 years. I'm the senior policy planner for Sonoma County, and I do their transportation policy. So I'm actually a policy person that tells people how to build roads and things like that, that's the way you change things, is you write the regulations. That's the best way. But we're talking about mountain bikes. We're not talking about roads. And actually now working at the coastal plants, I've even drifted aside. Now I'm doing resource management work. And I'm retiring in March, so that's it. Then I'm just going to ride my bike. And it's delightful after March. I can ride my bike whenever I want to. Anyhow, people were trying to ride bikes were riding bikes off-road all over the country, but you couldn't really buy a reliable bike and buy parts that were off-road specific until Specialized came along. So anyone before Synyard that says they invented the mountain bike, it's like, great. Like Joe Breeze is a good friend of mine. He'll freely admit that his hooded dropout was invented by Orville Wright, and you can see it if you go to the Dearborn Museum, where they've got the Wright brothers bicycle shop. Henry Ford moved it there, and they've got one of his frames that's in the middle of being put together. It's actually kind of cool, and they also got the little pedal powered wind tunnel and all the other stuff from when they were doing their early airplane work. But there it is. It's a Breezer dropout is in a Wright brothers bike. So that's been around for at least that long. But I mean, Joe is pretty good at saying everything is a reappropriation of the past rather than I invented it or it was my idea. But the one thing the stump jumper lacked was having somebody who was really a bicycle person, because Mike is a brilliant marketer. I mean, that was his strength, and he was good at logistics, good at import-export, but he'd never built a bike in his life. Actually, neither did Gary Fisher and a bunch of other people. But that's not what's important here is that it got enough people interested that companies like Fat City, that was Chris Chance Cycles, now had a market that was created by people getting these entry-level mountain bikes and saying, that's neat, and that was kind of fun, but I'm seeing that this bike has some limitations, so I need some of these. So my history is with Fat City, and I want to be clear that I'm just giving you this one vignette back into history, and this was happening all over the country. I guess I'm very pushed back pretty hard on people who kind of have put on the beer goggles of nostalgia and look back at who came up with what, when. I mean, it was happening everywhere. But so I met Chris when I was working for Aerosmith, and we thought this would be really cool. These things have gears on it, because the bikes that we're riding didn't have gears on them. So we got Sun Tour parts from him, put gears on it and whatnot. But he was a very traditional frame builder. He was a plumber, is what I would call him, because as somebody who's a welder, it's like anybody can solder stuff together, which is what you're doing when you're building with lugs. But he wanted to get beyond road bikes, so he was trying to do lugged mountain bikes, which is just an insanely difficult thing to do back in the day when you weren't able, you didn't have access to CNC equipment. The lugs were whatever was available on the market, but he was still, he had some pretty amazing things that he was doing in those first couple of years. This is in the early 80s. But a group of us, it was not just me, but there were people down the street that were working for him that were all engineering students at Northeastern. And actually the joke that they had is that they felt it's really good to have your grade point average and your blood alcohol level be the exact same number, that's the key to success. So they were like 7 years in on their bachelor's of science degree. But it's like Ron Andrews, who's one of those people from King Cage. And we said, you got to make these things like modern stuff. Nobody is soldering together race car chassis or anything like that. Let's weld them. And that was kind of seen as like, the barbarians at the gate. I mean, you have to very gentle, sneak up on the metal and just apply the right heat. It's like baloney. There's so many things in this world that are welded together that don't fail. And so the beginning of Fat City was we said, okay, great. I was off the road for a while. Wayne Kirk and Ron Andrews fit up 10 bikes, 10 tube sets. I tack welded them. Chris thought they looked butt ugly. We said, you know, we'll finish them up and we're going to powder coat them flat black and take them to the New York Bike Show, which dates this thing. And you know, we'll have them there if people want to buy them. Great. Otherwise, they're out. And they sold like crazy. They all sold the first day. And Chris is a very smart business person, so he immediately stopped brazing. Is where that one went. And it was happening in a lot of other areas. There was like this big change from how you built the bike, and this created this whole other opportunity, which is not having to use steel as a frame material. And of course, once again, it's like we didn't invent the idea of TIG welding bicycles. The BMX guys were doing it forever before we were. And so far as using alternative materials, Charlie Cunningham was doing that way before Fat City got going. But it was, you know, happening in a bunch of places at the same time. But the idea that you could weld it suddenly really opened up a lot of creativity in terms of materials, especially in my case, the idea that you could build bikes out of titanium, which came along in the mid-'80s. You know, none of us are sure why we had the idea. We just thought it was kind of goofy to make one out of titanium. And we had sources for it through Wayne and Ron and their connections at MIT. And actually Dave Wilson, who was the recumbent guru, was the one who set us up with people at Teledyne Blockchain Albany, and we got some tubing and the bikes broke. And they were terrible. And we did another one, and it stayed together, and it rode like a pile of slinkies put together. So they were really pretty awful. But the thing that we noticed is this was in the so again, suddenly we didn't see on the horizon the suspension. I mean, we were still, you have to always remember you're looking at things through, you can't look into the future, you can only look into the past. And we were seeing that bikes, mountain bikes that were strong enough to survive really hard trail use kind of rode like hell without any suspension, and things were really stiff. And you know, the light went on that we can make these things out of titanium, and they're too springy. So we're working at it from the other end, but they don't break. I mean, once we figured out how to weld them, which is why the first ones were breaking, they're practically indestructible. And we suddenly had this ability that the design wasn't dictated by strength, it was dictated by how much flex we wanted to have in the frame and how we wanted it to ride. It had nothing to do with weight. I mean, that's another urban myth that it was done. It was done for weight. It was done to make bikes before suspension happened, which we didn't know was, of course, being developed at the same time by other folks at the company that became RockShox. And that just changed everything. You know, once suspension became a thing, a lot of the things that you were doing to build a mountain bike didn't really make that much sense anymore. And you could have companies like Cannondale that made very, very rigid frames, but you had a suspension fork on it. So you could have this bike that really transmitted power nicely, and it didn't beat you up that much. But that's, you know, I guess the story here is that everything was kind of a confluence of coincidences, that there wasn't some brilliant geniuses behind everything. There were opportunities that were there, and people were seizing these opportunities or missing them as they came along. And that's really what was creating the evolution in the middle part of, I guess, the pre-2000 era. Actually, more than pre-2000, pre-1990 era of mountain biking, which is really when I got out of working in the bike industry and began teaching people how to build bikes. I moved on to working at United Bike Institute, teaching frame builders how to work with materials other than steel.
Is that thing still going?
Yeah, it's still going strong, and it's a great program. If you want to learn, if you want to learn how to build a bike just as a hobby, it's a great thing. You go up there in 2 weeks and you go home with a rideable, safe bike that you built yourself, and that's actually kind of an awesome thing. I mean, that's like off to the side here, but it's really, I'll tell you, even though I've built thousands of bikes, it's still really cool to ride a bike that you built. I mean, that just, I don't know, puts a smile on my face to know that I built the bike. You have a question?
Yeah. In the early parts of the mountain biking, as they were starting to come into focus with the suspensions and whatnot, what races or mountains themselves were being used to promote the durability of these bikes? Were the trails being groomed to showcase how they held up under certain stresses?
That's actually that's a super interesting question, because what was happening is there was riding for the experience, which was kind of a new thing. Is you'd ask someone, I went on a mountain, like they asked a road rider how it went for a ride. This is 68 miles. And back then, say, how long was it, you went for a mountain bike ride, it was this many hours. You didn't care how many miles it was this many hours. And racing was not initially a big part of what was going on. It was really an alternative to, if you want to ride a bike for exercise, especially, go back 30 years, most cities in the United States are just scary places to ride a bike. I mean, you get your heart rate up way faster going through downtown Philly at rush hour than you will doing a hill climb to the Rocky Mountains, because you're going to die. I mean, you're just convinced that you're going to die. And that's, but so far as, the weird thing about testing is Fat City and Merlin, Fat City especially was one of the first places that I ever encountered that did physical testing, that derelicts that they were, those guys really did have engineering degrees, although you wouldn't know it. But when it got serious, they actually knew how to do the calculations and knew how to figure things out. So there was a lot of static testing that was done. We never saw racing as a proving ground for the frames. It was a proving ground for the components, like for tire design, suspension design. Drivetrains are things that really got tuned in races, because if you're just riding cross country for pleasure, you're usually not working that stuff that hard. And it's not super critical if your tire isn't the best tire that you can get, as long as you didn't get a flat on it and had a great time, that's it. That was much later in the evolution, the Red Bull Rampage era of mountain biking, which I'm not part of, and I don't know anything really about. It's amazing to me, though. I mean, both the athletes and the equipment are jaw-dropping to me in Rampage. It's amazing. But we didn't really, we saw, and also racing back then, there was no money in it, and it was a social event and mostly a good time hangout in the woods. And the guys, my friend Joe Murray come home with like $250 an old trophy for like traveling across the country and beating himself up for a weekend at a fairly tough course. And also back then, racing was bigger in the East Coast than it is now. I mean, it kind of faded away, because cross-country racing on technical courses is not a spectator-friendly thing. It just isn't that exciting to watch. It's exciting to participate in. And the Western states have the high-speed downhill races like Mammoth that are just spectacular to watch, and it was a great hangout. So but the bikes, say, that eventually were used in races like Kamikaze were so different that even regular production bikes, it didn't really, at that point in time, change the evolution of a bike that, say, GT or Mongoose was selling on the commercial market. But it would change the sort of tires that Panaracer was selling. It certainly changed braking systems like night and day. We never would have gotten modern braking systems and modern suspension if it wasn't for racing. Because there really wouldn't be a demand for a brake system that's reliable at 60 miles an hour. I mean, that's just not something that normal people do. And this, you know, and the suspension is a part of mountain biking that I appreciate, but I never was involved in the design of or the evolution of. I never designed drivetrains either, although I love modern derailleurs. They're great, but I can't tell you much about how they evolved. So I hope that's kind of a rambling answer to your question, but does it?
Yeah, it did.
Okay. Are there other questions? This is actually a better format. Other people ask me a question. I'll make up an answer.
How did you get the tires made? I mean, there were road bikes, and then you started developing these tires, and it must have, I mean, you didn't make that many of them, I'm assuming, so who would?
We didn't. That was an interesting, so the unsung pioneer of the 29er evolution is Wes Williams from Ibis Cycles and Bruce Gordon, the crankiest person in cycling, may he rest in peace. But Bruce was a big believer in large diameter tires being the right thing. And it's because he had a huge amount of experience in touring, but big volume, large diameter tires. And Ibis saw that too as a better way to do a cross-country bike than 26-inch wheels. And we got these tires from Nokian in Finland called Speed Hakapolitas. And that was our experience with what does it take? It takes $30,000. That's what we found to get a die made. And whether you buy a tire, then it's a $30,000 tire, or you buy 1,000 tires, they're a lot cheaper. Then the materials are mostly what you're paying for. The OEM tire companies back then Taiwan was the offshore market. Nobody was doing anything in China yet, nothing significant. I think for a lot of mostly just because the Chinese factories hadn't yet seen a market opportunity, so they just weren't that good to deal with. But it was kind of amazing that we could just you get a mold made, and as long as you can come up with dough to get the mold made, anybody would do that, and they'd run off as many tires as you want. And so that was the Bruce Gordon Rock and Road, which I think was probably the first big volume 700C tire. That thing was around forever. There's a funny limit too because of how a tire mold comes apart and the equipment that is used to vulcanize it. There is kind of an absolute outside diameter that's very expensive to go beyond. So that's, when you see people like Coker with their 36-inch tires, those are made at a car tire factory, and they're really heavy, really clunky, made by a different process. And somewhere around about a 30-inch outside diameter, my understanding from talking to the tire guys is the upper limit of the equipment that's used to make very thin wall tires. It doesn't really work past that. So you'll see like, 700 by 65 or 70 is it. And you go bigger than that, and it isn't because a bigger tire wouldn't be better. It's very difficult to make with the equipment the tire companies have. But it was fun design. It was fun making tires. I mean, that was like, a thing I like about the bike industry is compared to other industries, you can be in it at a pretty low level and learn a huge amount about manufacturing. You never have access to those experiences if you're, say, in the car industry or something else that is making products. How about another? I asked my question. I know it. No?
Wait,
Okay.
what tires did you make?
Just the Bruce Gordon tires. That was the only ones that I was directly involved in. The Ibis tires, we ended up partnering with so I worked with Scott for a while, and I welded a lot of the Ibises. So I was involved in getting them up to speed with titanium bikes at the boat, and I worked with Castellano a lot on the bow tie. But Vittoria was really interested in working with IBIS. So the advantage we have there is we've got a really high-powered tire company that is pretty much, you just draw the design you want, send it to Italy, and we make it happen. Well, we make it happen in Vietnam, which is where the tires are. Actually, Vietnam and Thailand are where some of the best tires in the world are made right now. I mean, they really the factories in those countries understand the technology of rubbers better than almost anywhere. I mean, it's just kind of weird that you're going, I don't want a tire that's made in Thailand. Oh, yes, you do, because the people there really know what they're doing. And a lot of these big tire companies actually, if they aren't making their tires there, except for places like Continental that just insist on, yeah, we're going to process our latex in Germany. It's like, good on you. Go ahead. But most people do it with people who've got a lot more, I think, breadth of knowledge on processing latex. So that was, tires were a big part of early mountain bike evolution, because for a while, everybody thought that was voodoo and you couldn't make your own tires. And so you were actually, the weird thing is you were designing your bike around the available tires, not designing the best possible bike and then specifying tires to go on it. And that's a big change that happened in the 90s and the early 2000s, is the supply lines and the number of people that knew how to get tires made just increased radically. And so you could really design, because think of it, you're designing a car and you're saying, yeah, but you're telling the car designer you can only use one size tire in this car. So go ahead, design the best sports car you can, but you're using 16-inch rims and 55 profile tires that are 215 wide, and that's it. That's all you get to work with. I mean, they'd shoot you and throw you out of the room and say, I need to build this thing correctly. And that was a big part of the 90s evolution, was the flexibility began to really expand. The other thing that happened then is mountain bike specific component groups finally grew into their own. They weren't just modifications of road bike equipment. The mountain bike equipment was made specifically for mountain bikes, and brakes are a thing I just can't emphasize enough how much that totally changed the way you designed a bike and totally changed the sport. I mean, the idea that we have, people just take it for granted. We have braking systems that work pretty much flawlessly once you dial them in. And that's because you haven't had the experience of going 40 miles an hour in a downhill with Mavic cantilevers and wet rims. And that's another one that'll spike your heart rate up to an amazingly high level. Yeah.
Kind of going on that, with the evolution of the bikes, the mountain bikes, what has been the biggest amusement that you've seen for mountain bikes impacting road bikes? The braking systems are a perfect example. You see disc brakes on road bikes everywhere now, whereas mountain bikes were the ones who needed to stop on a dime.
Well, there's always was a funny, and I think I had a unique opportunity there in my involvement in the bike industry of starting my connection was with a road bike builder and seeing the bike world. That was my introduction to the bike world, was Chris Chance. And a lot of people that built mountain bikes came in through BMX or through something where they were kind of already, in that world. And it's an interesting disconnect between road biking. I have to have a polite way to say this, but tradition and ritual seem to be a huge part of, like, why do you have drop bars that are that shape forever all the time when, like, people wanted to flare them out? It's because that's the way the human wrist goes. It's like, it took forever. Or disc brakes are a perfect thing. Is like, yeah, road bikes really need good, reliable brakes, and still it's something that everybody got all on Twitter about. And that was a thing that attracted me, really, to building mountain bikes, is innovation was the driving thing. It was actually the opposite philosophy. Like, can you come up with a nuttier idea and push the envelope even further. And in road bikes, it's like, God, show me somebody who's got the courage to build road bikes without dropped handlebars. You know, you just won't see it. It won't happen. Not only that, build anything other than a road bike that really, in its heart, is designed for a competitive racer, period. That's it. So it's like, you go to back to cars. Let's say you could just go and buy an F1 car, but that's all you can buy. All you can buy is an F1 car. So yeah, you have to have the external starter. You think the stall speed is 5,000 RPM. The tires last 500 miles, and good luck putting groceries in the thing. And don't ever take it off road. I mean, but they go really fast under specific controlled circumstances, and that's what amuses me about the gravel bike movement. I mean, that puts a smile on my face how ironic and silly it is, because you know, it's a cyclocross bike that finally grew up, that finally evolved into what it should be, and it's nothing special. And people have been riding on gravel roads longer than they've been riding on paved roads. So it was a market. Once again, it was the other thing of the bike industry. This is my side rant for working in the advocacy side, is the bike industry is one of the few sports industries that does not understand that advocacy has to be at the core of their business model, that if you aren't getting more butts on bikes, then you're all splitting the same pie all the time, and it's like midget wrestling. You're not growing the industry, but we would try to get money when I ran the Sonoma County Bike Coalition from the big bike manufacturers, and they, you know, Trek would throw you $500. It's like, no, if we've got like something that could get more people riding bikes, you know, some of those people are going to buy Trek bikes. But if riding a bike on the street is still a scary experience for the average person, you're not going to grow the industry. If land managers are kicking mountain bikes off of trails, it's not going to grow the industry. So you've got to really get serious about your advocacy, and that's something that still to this day is just, you know, it's a huge problem. It's you know, we had recumbents, they were going to change the world. We had fat bikes, they were going to change the world. We got e-bikes, they're going to change the world. But you know what? You get on your e-bike, and still you go through traffic at rush hour, and if it scares the heck out of you, you're not going to ride that e-bike again. So you didn't really create a new, you sold a bike, so you sold some product, but until that product feels safe to use in the environment it's designed to be used on, people aren't going to buy more. The same thing as you buy the mountain bike, and if all the trails are closed and you're going to get a ticket every time, or the really nice trails, the ones that you really want to ride on, are closed to bicycles, that's kind of throws cold water on top of your enthusiasm for the sport. And you're probably going to put the bike on Craigslist and decide you're going to do something sensible, like take up curling. So that's, I don't know even how I got that far off to the side there, but it is a weird thing how road biking doesn't influence mountain biking, but mountain biking influences road biking, and I wish it was a little bit more, because you know, there's an opportunity missed just to have fast, comfortable bikes that people can ride on the street and occasionally take it and have an adventure, and we call them gravel bikes now. But it didn't need to take that long for that to happen, and they're still, you know, they're still not there yet. It's like gravel bikes should just be skinny tire mountain bikes and rock on and have at it, but they're not. So
Following up on that.
okay,
Go ahead.
we could do an in-conversation with,
Yeah.
you know.
I was just going to say, would you say that advocacy also emerged during the mountain biking emergence as well? With the growth of mountain bikes, there was more advocacy for biking in general.
Kind of, you know, that's the
Safer
kind
biking.
of-
I'll put it
right,
as
yeah.
safer biking.
The problem is that we had advocacy organizations who saw compromise as winning in mountain biking. And in road biking, I mean, the big difference was people are still dying on the roads. Mountain biking is a recreational sport. riding on the road can also be a form of transportation, and the consequences of bad facilities are more than just getting a ticket from the park ranger. So the bicycle coalitions tend to be way more politically engaged than people like IMBA. I mean, I won't bag on IMBA too much because they're well-intentioned, but they're really ineffective at what they do, because they're never like, look, we pay taxes. We have the same rights to the trails as the guys that are sitting on top of those big animals depositing piles of exotic grasses throughout your pristine wilderness. I mean, come on, let's get real here. Let's do a little. And the funny thing is, the equestrians are like golfers. They've faded over time because young people aren't that interested in equestrian sports, and it's a shrinking thing. And there's more and more electeds now that are bike riders than are horse riders, and there's more land managers that are bike riders than horse riders. And but then when we push back on that, it's very interesting because they are organized and they do advocacy the right way. I mean, they show up in big numbers, they get in your face, and they don't take no for an answer. And it's too bad that we don't do that more often for both safe places to ride and fun places to ride. That we just kind of, there is this like defeatist attitude of like, but you're not a cyclist, you're a person. You're a pedestrian, you're a driver, you're a cyclist. It's just, what are you, I don't know, you're a soccer player, you're whatever you're doing at the time, but people tend to look, it's a cyclist. It's a human being riding a bike. It's a person on a bike is what it is. Anyhow, don't get me going into advocacy. That's got nothing to do with the evolution of mountain biking, except that, getting back to your original question, it is weird how hidebound road riding is, and how, I mean, just things like, why do I have to wear a costume to ride the bike? Can I ride clothing? Can I ride in clothing that has no advertising on it? Apparently not. It's like, that's not possible just to get plain colored clothing and ride a bike. When you think of it, it's a little bit bizarre that you're going to have sponsors logos all over your clothing of people who never sponsor you, but you're paying them money to put their advertising on your clothing articles, and that's seen as like normal.
But there's an evolution of trail advocacy, because mountain bikers showed up, they were riding on horse trails, hiking trails, peak trails, right? So now, we get to your generation, you needed mountain bike trails, right? So there was some sort of advocacy.
I know my
change.
generation was a few years before that, but
right. So what were you riding?
I was always riding a bike with fat tires, but I rode it on
No,
road.
what were you riding it on? You were riding it on
Trails. Because initially there were no regulations on
Right.
trails. I mean, when I first started riding mountain bikes, they weren't restricted anywhere
Right.
at all. You could just go ride.
Right.
Nobody else knew what they were.
Yeah, and the thing is, A, there were so few of you, you were a novelty, and B, we didn't have Red Bull. I mean, that, no, and I don't mean the drink. I mean the attitude that the shredders have of, this is, yeah, I'm riding Rampage, and this is my course, and get out of my way. And
But there was an evolution to those courses.
yeah, right, yes. They're absolutely what. So, the steps in between where the sport became popular, and that's where we should have done a better job of advocacy. Once there were significant numbers of people where sharing the trail got to be a big deal. If you only encounter a mountain biker every couple of days, okay, some people are jerks, but it's not going to create conflicts. But when there are as many mountain bikers as there are hikers on a trail, that's a problem. And there was never a push for that there are in other areas. Other areas mean not the United States. So maybe there should be trails like they have in Canada and British Columbia that are mountain bikes only. And there's trails that are hiking only because they're appropriate for one class of user, and they recognize that putting both users on the same trail inevitably will create conflicts. But what worked there is they said, yeah, we need our own facilities. We should have facilities that are equal to the facilities that you're providing for hikers. So that's one solution if you have the tremendous amount of land resources that BC has. I mean, you're not going to do it in Philadelphia on the public parks in a big city like this because there's just too much demand for use of those trails, and that you're pretty much going to do it through trail etiquette. But the point is we shouldn't let bicycles be irrationally banned from a trail, and I think there was bike lash that occurred in the 90s and the early 2000s.
I think it's the same thing with rail trails.
Yeah.
Walkers and bikes really struggle to share rail trails.
And also it gets back to the trail designers. I mean, so in these older established parks, the trails are the trails, but there's no reason that your municipal planners shouldn't be writing specifications, which we do. I mean, that's one of my jobs right now, is specifying the trail cross sections, the designs, how it interfaces with public roads, and you do it with the idea that it has to accommodate all users. I think there's a little bit too much of folks saying it's really all about don't interfere with the hikers and don't interfere with automobile traffic, and we're good to go. And I've just described how to design your trails, and that's it. So that doesn't work. But getting back to the thing with road riders, because we did start with that, is I always struggled with what came from road riding that influenced mountain bike design, and I really have never been able to come up with a single thing that went in that direction, except maybe clipless pedals. But once again, there's an evolution now towards flats. So there's a lot of people, me, riding off-road that really prefer flat pedals. But clipless is a good thing they're good if you like them. If that gets you on a bike, put them on, and they're a great invention. I mean, they're a phenomenal piece of technology. And so that's something from road riding that went over to mountain biking. But everything else, like brakes, drivetrains, road bikers, try to get a road rider to agree that a one-by system is, I mean, finally the dam is broken. But a one-by system it's a great one. 11 speeds, 12 speeds, right in a row, no overlap. It's just delightful. Works fine. Tubeless tires. What's wrong with tubeless tires? Why is that even a discussion? But I guess you like flats. You like flats. You like standing around in the sliding around on the asphalt in funny shoes and wrestling with getting a too tight tire off of your carbon fiber rim that you'll eventually damage and have to throw out because you used a tire lever on it. So,
What about the first frame tubes that were used? Were those coming off of road bike tubing, or were you spec'ing out?
that's a really good, so initially yes, and some of the tubing you could get back then you can't get now, like Tongay Prestige was extraordinarily strong. I mean, and this I'm not saying from an engineer, I'm saying from a how many return frames do you get standpoint, which is really like cuts through all the engineering and everything. How often do we get a warranty return? The Tongay tubing was like a breakthrough after using Reynolds, which is what we used initially in Fat Cities. The Tongay frames just never broke. They dented, and sometimes they buckle. I mean, if somebody cracked, but that's really different. That's not like, yeah, if you come in and the head tube, down tube, and top tube are all crippled over, that's not the fault of the tubing or of the welder. That's just operator error at that point.
Well, wait a minute. Tangay is still being sold in Phoenix, made in Taiwan Tangays.
Now I'm talking about real prestige tubing made in
Yeah.
Japan.
I'm sure there's a difference, but
There's a huge, and they don't make prestige anymore, I don't believe.
well,
That stuff was really good.
that place in Phoenix sells Tangay tubing.
Tongay still makes tubing.
Yeah.
They absolutely still make tubing. But that line of tubing that they made was extraordinarily good. And it was discontinued a long time ago. You could still buy Tongay tubing. You couldn't buy Tongay Prestige. But the other thing that was happening is people were beginning to see that the tubing needs to be different diameter. This is the other thing is mountain bikes finally figured out who died and made steers 1 inch. I mean, a plumber is probably who did that. But why did we have 1 inch steers that were, as a builder, that was always the weak point. You're bending steers and forks when it was 1 inch threaded. They were just horrible. And that's the guys down in North Carolina. I mean, when they came up with the headset, that was another huge breakthrough in the evolution of bicycles overall, but especially, and it took forever for road bikes to say, oh, you know, the quillless stem is actually an advance as opposed to a going backwards sort of thing. But the next step in tubing was people just went to straight gauge chrome moly. And that, as a designer, gave you this huge amount of latitude because you weren't stuck with standard diameters. You could buy any diameter that you wanted to. You could really fine-tune the ride of the bike a lot more than you could with road bike tubing, which was always too small in diameter to build a really good handling mountain bike. And then of course, since everything is being welded and road bikes were still all being brazed at that point in time, it's like we could make it out of aluminum. We could make it out of titanium. I mean, we could make it out of other metals. And you're off to the races at that point.
But that straight gauge chronology is coming from BMX, right?
Well, it was all coming from Dillsburg Airplane Works in Pennsylvania. But yeah, it was the material was being made for experimental aircraft and race cars. I mean, the biggest consumer was race car chassis, especially roll cages. I mean, to this day, you've got to use chromoly for the roll cages in most classes of, I mean, we're not talking about F1 and stuff like that, but if you're, you know, Joe, whatever, living in racing a sprint car or something like that, you're doing that. And it's just, in motorsports, chromoly tubing is just kind of a de facto standard for making things. So it was produced in huge quantity and a variety of sizes. And there were a lot of experimental aircraft, like all the variants on the old Piper Cub were tube frame. You know, they weren't monocoque like modern airplanes. And the experimental plane guys still do a lot of fabric over a frame type of construction, although that's faded now with composites have gotten so easy to use and so ubiquitous and so accessible that, yes?
I didn't want to break the tangent.
Yeah.
You had talked about the evolution of the metals being used and whatnot. Not to quote Jurassic Park, but was there ever a time with mountain bikes that they were so preoccupied with whether they could or could not that they never stopped to think, should we be doing this? What would be one thing you're like, we probably shouldn't?
Magnesium and beryllium were two materials that were a bad idea. Beryllium was a super bad idea. Magnesium was a close second. And magnesium, it was just because really you'd end up having to die cast it. There's all kinds of complicated problems with welding magnesium as opposed to welding aluminum. And that was just one of those, you can teach a dog to walk on his hind legs, but why? It just annoys the dog. So that's kind of the answer about magnesium. And beryllium is one of those, there was a part of mountain bike evolution where it seemed like people were going down the entire periodic table and saying, if we can make it round and put a hollow in the middle, we're going to try and make a bike out of whatever it is. And that was actually kind of a standing joke. We were thinking we did make one out of copper because that was kind of easy to do. You just go to the plumbing supply and buy copper, but we're thinking, God, you could just like make it out of any metallic substance. But beryllium was a bad choice because it's toxic. It's really toxic. But it has the highest stiffness to weight ratio of anything on the periodic table. It's just incredibly rigid and incredibly light. And really dangerous to work with, and can only be put together with adhesives. So, and beryllium dust is pretty much fatal in any significant quantity going into your body. So, but Brush Wellman did make 3 or 4 beryllium frames. They actually were made. by a company that, because cast beryllium is used for brake calipers in a lot of bigger aircraft. I mean, it does have where you can isolate it from the rest of the world and use its properties to its maximum potential. It's got some legit commercial uses, but bike tubing sure isn't one of them. And yeah, we had got Gary Klein and his boron fiber. You know, it's like, dude, get a life. that was just silly. And we, for a while, thought our whole thing with titanium. We did begin to think the titanium thing was silly until we finally, luckily, connected up with. This is like one of those coincidence things. Met the Malachevsky brothers that ran Ankotech, which is one of the three big titanium mills. They're out of business now, and they just thought, well, they were into Polish guys from Detroit, and they were like stereotypes. They were great, and they loved hockey, and they were working with the Red Wings to make titanium hockey sticks. They were like hockey shafts made, because the stuff had a ridiculous amount of snap to it. I mean, it turned out it never got anywhere because the NHL was like, no, we're not going to let you do this. But I've got some of their shafts that they made. I mean, they actually made a few, they tried them out. The thing was like cracking a whip, apparently. It would just like snap that puck at a bazillion miles an hour with a lot of control. So it was good if you wanted to behead somebody with a hockey ball. But that didn't. So you know, they said, bikes, what are these bike things? And it said, look, if you guys can make hexagonal tapered hockey shafts, I'll bet you guys can make bike tubing. I said, sure, and they did. And they educated us a lot. They both us and the guys at Lightspeed, they brought us out to the mill quite often, and had us, you know, we talked to the metallurgists, and they were patient enough with these idiots from the bike industry to tell us we're not, because the bike industry is full of armchair engineers. It's full of people who think they're the smartest person in the room, like besides you. But there's other people too, I mean, that are the smartest people in the room. But there's a lot of them, and they were like, okay, yes. Hubris aside, we're going to tell you how the big kids do this, and you can listen to us or not. And we did listen to them because they were really right about a lot of stuff, and we never would have been successful with Merlin had we not talked to them and had them solve a lot of really involved, like the welding wire that we were using. We were doing everything that we could, and the stuff was still failing at the weld. And we sent the material to them to be tested, and it wasn't contaminated. It was in good shape. But they said, no, you should use 6.4 ELI, extra low interstitial, that is used to do repairs on hip joint castings. It's a super, super high pure, and the idea is it is very tolerant of the metal that you're fusing together, having some impurities in it. It'll dilute those impurities, which in the tube, it's all been, they're rotary forged, they're not drawn. Titanium tubes are squished around mandrels as opposed to drawn down a draw bench. And the grain is pretty refined, but when you weld it, you're getting big gross grain boundaries, because now it's a casting at that point, and using that material solved the problem of cracking completely. I guess won't go too deep into that, but it was like, yeah, you guys are geniuses. Thank you. Yeah, it just moved along. But anyhow, that was, and once we solved that, we were off to the races. We worked hard at Merlin at creating mythology that titanium was hard to work with. I mean, it was a purposeful disinformation campaign. Because you didn't want people, you know, the thing is, there wasn't anything proprietary, there wasn't anything patentable, and I'm not a big fan of this whole intellectual property thing for bicycle stuff. I mean, this is bicycles, this is not, you know, spacecraft. So the only thing that we had was our manufacturing techniques and our people, and having other people be intimidated by what we do, so they aren't going to try too hard to copy us. And that was a pretty good recipe for success. I mean, we did pretty well with Merlin, and selling titanium bikes. So the Linsky brothers did equally well, but then we started teaching people how to weld titanium bikes at United Bike Institute, and it's like, yeah, I can set somebody up in their garage and you can whip out a titanium bike in a weekend and it's going to be just as good as a Merle. I mean, the welding may not look that great because you're not a good welder, but that's it. And if you're a good welder, it might look just like a Moots when you're done. So you had another question.
No, I was raising my hand because I was
Smartest
an
person in the
example
room.
of the smartest person in the room.
Could you talk?
You are the smartest person in this
Well-
room. I know that.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody has to be.
Exactly.
Can you talk about some of the silliest developments you saw, like gimmicky things that
Besides recumbent bikes.
in, just kind of as the,
Flex-
because I
flex
remember
stem?
back in the 80s, they came out with like a fake dropper that you could loosen.
Oh yeah, the
like
height
a
right.
spring.
That was a.
Just
And we're also not going to do the Allen X mountain bike. That's a yeah, they're sandbagging if you're calling that one out. You know, fat tire bikes were kind of silly, but they had their niche purpose. But really silly stuff. Yeah, I mean, you got it with the Thudbuster seat post. I mean, all the workarounds to proper suspension in the beginning days of suspension there's some pretty grotesque things that were done back then. But then once you've got good suspension, it's like, why are you going to bother with that? The bike takes care of the problem correctly for me. You know, and some of the other bad ideas are just bad ideas of cycling, like some of the automatic shifting systems. They're not mountain bike specific, they're really silly, but they aren't necessarily part of the evolution of mountain bikes. You know, it's some evolutionary dead ends, but those aren't necessarily bad ideas. Those were ideas that ended up not going anywhere, and people came up with other solutions. I mean, all the variants on rim brakes. I mean, eventually it's like, yeah, but the problem really is that they're rim brakes. I mean, that's what's wrong here, not that it's not a clever idea on how to grab on. The Peterson self-energizing brake, that one is way up there. If any of you guys, who knows what those are? Okay.
I remember hearing that.
Has anyone ridden one? Yeah.
It's on a fat too.
Okay, how exciting is it?
It scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
You'll lock up that.
It does stop, it stops the wheel from rotating, but so is throwing a stick in the stars. And it's about that controllable. So that was, yeah, that would actually, because that's one of the few bad ideas that could kill people. So maybe that might actually be the worst ever. But once again, it was driven by this thing of rim brakes, you know, inherently didn't have the capabilities that you need in a mountain bike. So that was kind of like an act of desperation. It's like, maybe if we just squeeze the rim harder and use the energy from the rim to make it squeeze even harder still, the faster you're going, that'll slow you down, and it will slow you down, but you'll also get to see if your helmet still is under warranty too.
I'm running on the front.
You never ran one on the front? No. Coward.
And that's why bikes don't have anti-lock braking systems, because they shouldn't lock up.
They shouldn't, but you should be able to just modulate and make that happen. You know, some of the early Magura hydraulic brakes, the trials guys swear by those things, but they were kind of once again, silly idea because they were grabbing the rim. You know, the ones that you had to braze on special posts, and if you mounted them too hard, you ruined the pistons and they'd seize up and didn't work. But there weren't, I can't think of any other really crazy, silly, I mean, there were some silly trends, like the initial trend towards short chainstays, like shorter, like finally you're splitting the seat tube because you want to go even shorter still, and somehow that's going to make you climb better, and the reason you're not climbing well is because you're fat, okay? You're gravitationally challenged, and as somebody who is, firsthand experience. F equals MA, and you can't cheat physics. That's like the short chain stays are not it will make the bike wheelie when you're going up a really steep hill with good gearing and make it impossible to control, and it'll make it super uncomfortable on a washboard if it's a hardtail. But besides that, it's a great idea. So that was, and it makes it so you can't run decent tires. So that was, your drivetrain is cattywampus, because that was back in the day of triples in the front that one buys hadn't really become a thing. I tell you, that's index shifting is something that is like up there in my hall of fame that has really changed cycling for the better, like on account of, like no one can even imagine. Well, you know, there's retro grouches that want to go put friction shifting on, but for most people, modern index system is just incredible. It's amazing that it works as well as it does. It shouldn't work that well, but it does work that well.
I have a question about the future, even though it's history.
I don't talk about the future. That's, for the future, I'm just going to ride bikes. That's
Well,
the
out of
question.
curiosity, you know, there's like material shortages kind of still is remaining from COVID. I mean, do you think that's created anything interesting and new out of necessity? Like,
It's hard to get materials of any kind that aren't produced domestically, and even those sometimes, if the ultimate supply chain isn't domestic, they're still difficult to get. So that's always going to be interestingly, aluminum is probably the easiest thing to get a hold of, and that's not that easy to get in the alloys you want and the sizes you want to build a bicycle. I mean, if you're just doing architectural railings, it's not that tough. That was actually the other, my very good friend, Craig Cal, but because composite bikes are something I know nothing about. I'm going to be the first person who's like, composites, it's voodoo. They initially were, this is actually kind of an interesting story about materials is, and this was why Merlin broke up as a company. Our feeling was we looked at the failure of the Graphtec and the Teledyne Titan. And so the Graphtec was the first commercially produced carbon fiber bike long time ago. And the Titan was the second, because the Speedwell in England was the first titanium bike ever produced commercially. And the Titan was the first one done in significant quantity. Both of them had horrible rates of failure and poisoned the public against, you know, you just couldn't build out of that, because the material got a bad rap because of bad engineering, not necessarily because the material is inherently bad. And early on in Merlin, Mike Oxberger, there were three partners, Gwyn Jones, Mike, and myself. Mike and I were pretty clear with Gwyn that we're not sharing sales information, design information, things like that with Lightspeed, but we are going to share stuff about failures and warranty returns, because if we find out something's making our bikes break, it's probably making their bikes break, and conversely, if their bikes break, it's going to hurt our sales. And so we have to succeed was our big thing that we got between us, which interestingly the carbon fiber guys didn't initially, because Kestrel had some pretty funny growing pains when they first tried to make bikes, and once again, it was sheer hubris on their part. They were the smartest guys in the room, and you couldn't tell them anything. But our third partner, who was a money person, strongly disagreed that we should share any information with the enemy. And I said, it's not the enemy. He's our competitor, but he's a nice guy. So I sold my shares in the company over that. I was done with working there at that point. I moved to the West Coast, so I wouldn't kill anybody. But you know, the carbon eventually became, you know, just evolved by leaps and bounds and got past everything else in terms of a lot of performance characteristics. It's wonderful material just in the range of ways you can manipulate it that you can't do with metal. But I don't understand how to do it, so I'm not going to say it. You know, I'm not going to. Carbon bikes are great. Buy one if you like them. If you like the way they ride, just ride a carbon bike. That's what I have to say about that. But yeah, because the The other thing that was beginning to happen, which I think is cool, is using organic materials like bamboo to build bikes, which is more than just a novelty item. I mean, people think of it that way, but I look at what my buddy Craig Calfee is doing, and he's like Mr. Carbon Bike too, but his project with building bamboo bikes, those things are fabulous, and it's giving people mobility in countries where, I mean, it's changing their lives by giving people in developing countries a way to build bicycles and be able to get around quicker than they can by walking, but using materials that are available to them and technologies that are appropriate to what facilities they have available to them. I mean, if you're in a place that doesn't have electricity, you still can wrap fiber and glue around bamboo and build the thing. That you could get a bike built. So I just think it's totally cool what he's doing with bamboo.
On that note, there's an exhibit upstairs
Yeah.
that is doing that in Ghana.
Mm-hmm. I know. I want one. They're really great. Any other lies you want me to tell you guys? I can make things up, too, like I said. But we're going to go into this in depth with Drew, who knows way more about. He's more of an expert on the industry too. I know the part that I deal with and the people that I deal with, but it's kind of myopic. I don't have broad experience that way. Just with bikes.
So when was Merlin? Is Merlin still around?
Yeah. Oh, they're upstairs. They got a
Yeah.
booth. They're here.
So when were you at Merlin?
I started it, so that was we started in '86, we incorporated in '87, sold all my shares in '90. So it was brief. And the first titanium bikes we built in Fat City. And
You're like right in the same complex.
we were across the parking lot from each other, and we ruthlessly poached employees from them. We saw Fat City as like, oh, you got this new guy, and he's a rock star. Now, once you've trained him up.
There's a story about which one was cooler to work for. I can't remember if it was them or you.
It depends. They had way more fun in Fat City.
Yes, that's the story.
Fat City was the total fun hogs.
They were fun. You guys were like the engineer scientists. I think
No,
that's the story I
we
heard.
were. That's an image that Rob Vandermark likes to cultivate, but because that sells the bike business is the rocket science
I
myth.
think it was an interview with Janet.
Yeah, he could say that. He didn't work at Merlin ever.
Yeah.
I worked at both places. So,
Who thought of the hand job cable stop?
that is Scott Nickel. Chuck Ibis, as we call him. I still call him. But that was an Ibis thing.
Oh,
And they're kind of cool.
Toe Jam was the other one?
Yeah, the Ibis crew was another bunch of fun hogs. I mean, that was a serious fun place to work. But that was on the West Coast. That was when things went down. Okay, everybody's sneaking out. I must be boring people to death. It's 5:30. God, it's time to go home. Have a beer.